Good afternoon, my name's Graham Moore. I'm a professor in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University and Deputy Director of the Decipher Research Centre, and I've been heavily involved in SHRN over the last few years. And today I'm going to be talking about some research we've been doing looking at socioeconomic status, mental well-being and pupils' experience of the transition through to secondary school. So just to give some background, I mean, as we all know, transition from primary school to secondary school is a key milestone in pupils' development and then in their life course. And for many young people, it's a really positive thing. Most pupils really look forward to transitioning to secondary school. It's an opportunity for developing a wider network of friends, provides opportunities for great new challenges, personal growth. Lots of young people say that they look forward to joining older family members or other people they know from their community who've already moved on to secondary school. But lots of young people also feel quite anxious about the idea of moving to secondary school, particularly things like anxieties about bullying. And bullying often does tend to peak in the first couple of years of secondary school as young people try to kind of assert their dominance amongst a new kind of set of peers. Young people talk about anxieties about the changing nature of peer relationships, whether they'll be able to retain the friends they've got, and things like just getting lost in a bigger physical environments, as well as loss of kind of relationships with teachers from primary schools, and sometimes concerns that disciplinary environments will be much stricter in the new school. And it's a time of great ambivalence in that many pupils actually hold negative and positive thoughts about the idea of moving to their secondary school simultaneously. It's often not straightforwardly positive or negative. Now, there is emerging evidence from, including from some of the analysis we've been doing, that pupils experience more anxiety about some pupils experience more anxiety about transition than others, and that tends to be particularly the case for pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds or pupils with existing mental health difficulties. And what this means essentially is that anxieties about transition often tend to be greatest for pupils who are already at an elevated risk of poor school engagement. So there is a risk that school transition could be a critical period during which inequalities in young people's health and well-being, there's a risk of them widening at that stage. So in terms of what we already know about socioeconomic status and pupil well-being from some of the work we've been doing with SHRN over the years, we know that most indicators of well-being tend to be poorer amongst pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and that socioeconomic factors operate at multiple levels. So in previous rounds of SHRN, we found that pupils from poorer families often have worse outcomes in terms of well-being, a range of kind of health risk behaviours. And that's also the case for pupils attending schools with overall poorer intakes. And those trends are independent from one another in that the kind of impact of going to a more disadvantaged school isn't entirely explained by an individual's circumstances, but pupils and pupils' kind of family and school environments kind of interact with one another. And what we often find is that pupils with the lowest well-being tend to be those pupils who are from poorer backgrounds, but in terms of their families, but we're also attending schools which have more affluent overall intakes. And pupils, we often find that pupils' relationships with school staff tend to be somewhat better within more disadvantaged communities, particularly amongst pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And there are lots of explanations for why this might be the case, why school and family level socioeconomic factors interact in this way. There's lots of theory from kind of sociology around some of the psychosocial processes associated with relative position within a socioeconomic hierarchy. So young people from poorer backgrounds who are surrounded by more affluent peers, that might have detrimental impacts on their well-being through kind of negative social comparison processes. It also potentially creates emotional work for children in feeling that they have to hide their poverty from peers who are better off than they are. And actually, schools for whom most pupils are from disadvantaged backgrounds are sometimes perhaps more sort of sensitive to the needs of those pupils, because they make up such a dominant kind of proportion of the student body as a whole. Whereas sometimes schools with more affluent intakes, there are lots of kind of hidden costs associated with the school day that can sometimes make young people's poverty visible. So what the analysis I'm going to be talking about today, I was interested in how socioeconomic status dynamics change in transition from primary to secondary school. And primary schools tend to serve a much more narrowly bounded geographical region than secondary schools. They serve a smaller, more tightly defined community. So there's a tendency for pupils within primary schools to be somewhat more similar to one another in terms of socioeconomic status, but there's a tendency for kind of greater difference between schools at that stage. But when pupils transition to secondary school, 5 or 6 primary schools, each of which serve a somewhat different community, tend to converge on a single secondary school. So pupils will typically move into a school which has a greater kind of socioeconomic diversity than their primary school did. And what that means is that if you're from the cluster of 6 schools transitioning into a secondary school, if you're from the most disadvantaged school within that cluster, you're going to move into a secondary school in which most pupils are better off than you are, and your relative socioeconomic position will be lowered, which can have a detrimental impact on your well-being. If you're from the most affluent school within your cluster, you're probably going to move to a school in which most pupils aren't as well off as you are, so your relative socioeconomic position is increased, which might have a positive impact on your well-being. And the risk there is that this means that impacts on transition are likely to be most positive for children who are already in relatively advantaged positions, and vice versa. So these socioeconomic processes, as pupils move from primary to secondary school, could lead to a widening of inequality. So for the analysis I'm going to talk about now, for pupils in years 7 and 8 of the 2017 Churn survey, we asked what primary school they'd attended. We measured their mental well-being using a validated scale, which is called the Short, Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which is a measure of positive mental well-being. From routine data records, we identified the socioeconomic composition of the child's primary school, so the percentage of children entitled to free school meals, the same for the secondary school. And we also analysed the relative socioeconomic composition of the child's primary and secondary school. So what was the difference between the free school meal entitlement levels of the primary school that they came from and the secondary school that they moved to? And what we were interested in the analysis was looking at, when we asked young people about their well-being in the first 2 years of secondary school, what's the contribution of primary and secondary school contexts, and explaining variance within young people's well-being at that stage. We're also interested in whether the socioeconomic composition of primary and secondary schools both impacted on young people's well-being, and also whether mental well-being following transition to secondary school was associated with the kind of relative socioeconomic composition of a young person's primary and secondary school. So did moving from a more affluent school to a more deprived school, or vice versa, have an impact on young people's well-being? And what we found in relation to the first research question is that there's significant variability in young people's mental well-being, explained by both the primary school that they went to and the secondary school that they were currently in when they did the Churn survey. And actually, even though mental well-being here was measured in secondary school, the percentage of variability explained by the primary school they went to was slightly higher, which suggests that there are kind of enduring impacts on well-being of the primary schools that young people go to, which do endure into the first year or two of secondary school at least. We found that Socioeconomic status of the primary school the child went to and the secondary school the young person then attended were both quite similarly associated with young people's mental well-being. Attending a more disadvantaged school was associated with slightly worse mental well-being. But we also found a significant association of the relative affluence of a child's primary and secondary school, so movement from a poorer to a more affluent school or vice versa. We found that if a child moved to a secondary school that was more affluent than the primary school that they went to, that was associated with a reduction in well-being score and vice versa. So if pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds are moving to a school in which you'd expect other people to be better off than they are, then that has potentially detrimental impact on their well-being. So that's consistent with the kind of hypotheses we discussed earlier. Now, the paper that I had on the screen a slide or two ago, that was published in the British Education Research Journal in March. It was published literally about a week before we went into full sort of national lockdown, and the journal asked me to write a blog piece kind of reflecting on the implications of these findings for in the context of COVID-19. And the importance of transition. We know that COVID-19 has created a cohort of young children whose primary school career was ended very abruptly. Most young people had a few half days back in school before breaking for the summer. And we also know that COVID-19 has had really quite profound impacts on inequalities, rapidly deepening inequalities through lockdown, which probably means that pupils are facing this already quite turbulent period, transition to secondary school, with their already somewhat disadvantaged starting points amplified. In terms of some of the implications of these findings going forward, we know the transition to secondary school is a key point in children's school career, during which socioeconomic inequalities in well-being are likely to widen. And I think this really does kind of emphasise the importance and the value of kind of joined up working between primary and secondary schools to support pupils' well-being throughout their entire school career. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at doing over the next year or two is kind of trying to develop models for extending some of our SHRN work down into, to start with, the upper years of primary school, to look at whether we can kind of provide sort of similar feedback and provide ways of kind of clusters working together with data to kind of plan for that transition through to secondary school. And I think there's only so much that schools can do about these inequalities. They often have structural roots, and so they need structural solutions, but a combination of effective kind of universal and targeted intervention, both in primary schools and secondary schools, and at the point of transition, is likely to be important in kind of reducing socioeconomic inequalities in young people's well-being.